Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. In looking into Debbie's case, that then led me to trying to better understand wrongful conviction and how it happens, I came across a study in a law review that was actually a study on the effects of the justice system in one state versus another, but the effects on surviving family members. And there was this quote that really resonated with me, and it says, "Until survivors speak for themselves, however, society will continue to project its hoped-for outcome on their experience, and the voice of survivors will only be heard in reaction to the presumptions and misrepresentation of their journey." So my friend Stephen Saloom, who was the policy director at the Innocence Project, had invited me to come speak at their conference on the effects of wrongful conviction, on the effects of the victim's family. And I was excited about the opportunity to go, but I also felt apprehensive in that it almost felt like I would be in trouble for talking about this stuff out loud. And I really didn't know in trouble by who. I just had a lot of reluctance to talking about it, I guess, where someone else, would hear me. Because I still lived in the same town, and I still went to church with the district attorney and the chief of police. And so I was really reluctant on being vocal about not just the things that I had found out, but how I felt about it. But I did end up going, and when we went to, there was like a meet and greet the night before, and I went to the Innocence Project offices, and I was really kind of surprised. It wasn't anything fancy or there were just rows and rows of filing cabinets, and it looked like it was, really set up, built to get work done. And when I stepped in the front office there where the receptionist would have sat, there was a big photograph, a framed photograph that sat behind the desk. And I had this immediate reaction to this photograph because I knew exactly what it was before it actually registered who it was. And it was the signature red Oklahoma dirt. And it was a thin man wearing blue jeans and an A's baseball cap. And he was standing near a white, like a baseball base. And he had his hands in his pockets. And his eyes were kind of cast down. And he had kind of a daze on his face. And his jaw was kind of slightly open and kind of cocked to one side. And I knew that look, someone who was medicated from a severe, for severe mental illness. And I knew the man, and it was Ron Williamson. And I just remember kind of staring at the photograph, and Steve said, "Isn't that fantastic?" And I really just kind of answered with a nod. And I found it hard to even look away. And still today, when I see that photograph, it really speaks volumes, because there are, I mean, clearly he's on a baseball field, but there are no chalk lines that lead to the base or anything, and he's just kind of standing there in a field alone. And they brought us into the conference room where we were just having pizza, and it was very casual. And there were lots of people chatting and, buzzing about. And we were being introduced, and I noticed there were these same types of photographs all through their offices. And it turns out that these were photographs of exonerees, and some were with their families. But a lot of the photographs were taken at the crime scene of the crimes they were wrongfully convicted of. And all these photographs are actually in a coffee table book, if you ever have interest to look. It's called The Innocents, and it's by an artist named Taryn Simon. But as we entered the conference room, there was another one of these photographs, and I remember glancing over at my mom, and she, you made that eye contact that she also saw it. And the one that was in the conference room was of Dennis Fritz, and his photo had his mother and his daughter in it as well. And they're standing kind of in this pile of what looks like kind of piled up pink insulation in kind of the skeletal remains of an old building. And it turns out that old building was the coach lot. And their faces were really solemn, almost to say like this is where their nightmare began. And neither my mom or I said anything, but I think it probably crossed both our minds that it was the same for us, and that had been the last place Debbie had been seen alive. And so the next day I went back to their offices to participate in the panel discussion, and I really wasn't sure what I was going to say, so I just decided that I would start at the beginning. And I was a little nervous because I'd never talked about some of this stuff, and I'd never talked about this stuff in front of my parents before, who were there also. But just as I started to speak, Barry Scheck walked in the room, and he never took a seat. He just kind of walked in and stood by the door in the back of the room. And I wondered why he had come, either, to monitor what I say, or, was he just curious? I didn't know. But within the first few minutes of talking, I really started to tear up. And I noticed that others in the room were wiping tears. And I explained the guilt and the shame that my family felt like we owned, and that feeling that we had contributed to Ron and Dennis being sent to prison for someone else's crime. And when I finished speaking, Barry spoke up from the back of the room. And he said, "You wouldn't believe it. I mean, these guys were completely railroaded, and we didn't even know the half of it till the civil suit." And Barry's interjection made me feel validated, but I remember thinking, like, there it is again, that damn civil suit. Like, what else is there that we don't know? And I was the last one to speak that day, and there were lots of people that approached me and thanked me for coming. And but there was this one woman in particular who I remember, she came over, and I was still sitting in a chair, and she came over and knelt down beside me, and she put her hands on my knees, and she introduced herself. And her name was Katie. She was the director at another Innocence Project in a different state. And her eyes began to fill with tears. And she said, "I want you to know how very sorry I am for what all your family has been through." And she went on to tell me about her mother and how her mother had been wrongfully convicted for murder, and how she went to law school and spent 10 years to help her get out. And the genuineness that she had just warmed my heart, because that was the first time anyone had ever apologized for what my family had been through. I think too often victims' families are only heard from leading up to a trial or during a trial, and we rarely get to see the full scope of that journey, because there's this perception of, well, that's how things should be, so that must be how they are. So I guess the night that before we flew back, my husband and my parents and I, we all went out to dinner, and we were kind of talking about the trip and what we thought, and my mom brought up something that she said, there's one thing that, so this was my mom talking, she said, "There's one thing that I really feel guilty about." And I was like, okay. And she said, you remember Michael. Now, Michael was a guy I went to high school with. He was a little older than me, but he was Ron Williamson's nephew. And I didn't know that. I did not know that he was Ron's nephew. He was, I didn't have any idea. But anyway, my mom went on to tell about how what a sweet kid that she thought he was. And anyway, that there was a time when Michael and I had started to kind of run around together, and he'd come by the house several times and stuff. And my mom said that she called his mom and told her Christy and Michael have been hanging out a lot, and I'm not sure what's going on, and I don't think that Christy knows Michael is related to Ron. And your brother killed my niece, so whatever this is not going to work. It needs to stop right now. And Michael's mom said that she would take care of it. And my mom said, even back then, that she felt bad to even call, because it wasn't Michael's fault, and he hadn't done anything wrong. But then to find out that Ron hadn't done anything wrong either just made her feel worse. And so it was this other situation where my family had been put in this predicament to later find out, it's just another bad situation. So up to this point, the book had not been released just yet. It was about to be. And Dennis Fritz and I, and John Grisham and I, we'd all stayed in contact. And Dennis took it upon himself to invite me and Peppy to the book release party. And then I got a call from Mr. Grisham, and he had said that he wanted us to come, but he did want to voice his concerns, and that he didn't want it to be a sad occasion or anything like that. That, you know, it was, you know, time for everything to be happy and the book coming out, and I understood. But anyway, Peppy and I went, and my parents went as well. And I have to say, it is a very bizarre feeling to walk into a room full of strangers that knew exactly who you were, but we didn't know any of them. And you could see the anticipation on their faces waiting for our reaction. So Mark Barrett, who was Ron's attorney, who, you know, I'd met when I met Mr. Grisham, he approached us first and introduced himself and welcomed us there. And then Dennis spotted us and came right over, and he asked Peppy if he could give her a hug, and she did. And the irony of the situation was, it was just so bizarre. Because here was this man who, not too long ago, we believed for years and years that he had killed Debbie, and here we were at this gathering in a social setting. It was just so strange. And after everyone had dinner, people began to get up and talk, and some of Ron and Dennis's attorneys spoke. And at one point, Dennis got up and spoke, and then kind of impromptu, he asked me if I would say a few words. And I was kind of caught off guard. I didn't know what to say. But I remember that I was about 6-7 months pregnant, I guess, with my daughter, and I normally wear high heels, but they were killing my feet, and I'd taken them off under the table, and he called me up there. And so here I am walking literally barefoot and pregnant, God, up to give this talk or whatever. And I thanked Mr. Grisham for inviting us and having us there that evening, but I said I really felt like the credit should go to Ron. That he was the one that had built that bridge between my family and everyone else that was in that room. That had he not made that phone call, or that first phone call to Peppy, the outcome may have been very different. But it was just a very strange night. And on the ride home, everyone was kind of quiet. And I don't think really any of us could put into words the experience. It wasn't a bad one. It was just weird in that we were so welcomed, and I don't know, just so welcomed, and people were so glad that we were there. I don't know, just kind of strange. But on the heels of this party, Dennis was also going to be holding a book signing for his upcoming book release, and it was going to be happening in Ada. And so Dennis wrote a book that came out about the same time, and it's called Journey Toward Justice. And he again had asked Peppy and I to come. And truth be told, I think we wanted to go because we were a little worried about him being back in Ada and not knowing how people would receive him or treat him. And to my relief, there was a long line waiting out the door to have him sign books, and it went really well. And I remember just kind of hanging out in a side room when Peppy came up to me and introduced me to a lady by the name of Bonnie Flowers, who was actually the woman. She was the single vote that kept Dennis from getting the death penalty. And she's a very sweet lady, and she's an older lady, but very sweet and very proud that she still took care of herself and mowed her own lawn. I remember that. And she gave a great deal of insight into how the verdict in Dennis's case came to be. And she explained how shocked she was by the conversation about Dennis and how he was at, kind of a bar goer, and even the conversation about Debbie and how she worked in a bar as though they both deserved what happened to them. And this was conversation amongst the jurors. And she recalled a conversation that she had with, I guess, the jury foreman, that she really didn't feel like Dennis was guilty, but the foreman, she explained, had told her that if she voted for guilty, that when it came down to the sentencing portion, that they wouldn't give him the death penalty. So she agreed to go with guilty, even though she felt like he wasn't. But then she said when they got back there that she had been lied to. And when they called a vote for the death penalty, the very first thing, and every one of them raised their hands but her. And she said she was so mad that she pushed her chair back from the table and told them, "You better get your coats on because it's going to get cold in here." And she said she wasn't budging, and she stuck to it. And she was the woman that ended up saving his life. And about this time, still there are all kinds of articles in the paper, and the book is, John Grisham's book's coming out, and Dennis's book is coming out, so there's lots of stuff in the paper about the books. And I guess just days after Dennis's book signing, the publisher of our local news, his name was Lonnie Beasley, he was chiming in. And he wrote in a column, and the title of the column was, "There are two sides to every story." So the first half of this article kind of gave a short history of how Mr. Beasley came to his practice of the theory of balancing both sides. And the second half of the article explained how Grisham's book had painted a negative picture of the local DA, who was only out to get a conviction. And he encouraged readers to read an article published in the Wall Street Journal written by the vice president of the National District Attorneys Association. And it was called he said at the end of the article, "Before you make up your mind, please read the column. You may find it enlightening." So of course I went right to the column. And I found it less than enlightening, in that it was a recap of the same defense with this added claim that, quote, the freeing of Williamson and Fritz was the result of the legal system's checks and balances. And I was just floored by this blasé attitude that innocent people on death row, that going to prison was just really no big deal. And I wondered how someone could defend or even be pleased with how the criminal justice system had prevailed, as if all those years in prison weren't really that, no big deal. That in the end, the system prevailed. So, a few months had gone by and the book had come out. And there were, still lots of articles and letters to the editor and things like that. And I guess at the same time, the city and the Chamber of Commerce and City Council and all that are getting just inundated with basically hate mail. And one of them, there was a quote from one that said, there's a letter to the editor, and it said, I'm writing in regard to your recent editorial in Sunday's Ada Evening News in reference to all the negative publicity from John Grisham's book, The Innocent Man. John Grisham did not create the injustices. He only brought them to light. And the gentleman's letter went on to state that the local leadership should be embarrassed by the negative publicity. And he talked about restoring trust in our local officials and our courts, and he talked about the misconduct in the case. And the letter ended with, get involved and let's correct the problem. And again, like I said, these articles and letters are pretty much daily. But Mr. Beasley wrote again in a column titled, Peterson Did What He Was Paid to Do. And the column opened with an email from a lady in Boston who had written in. And she was really chastising the community and the district attorney after reading Grisham's book. And Beasley stated that recent emails to the paper and to the chamber pretty much echoed the same message. And he went on to explain his struggle in responding to this type of email. And after careful consideration, decided that he would. And so this was his quote. I sculpted a response to Kathy that thanked her for her note and said, we understand Mr. Grisham's book shed light on an error that unfortunately has occurred in many small and large communities across our nation, not just in Ada, Oklahoma. And so the letter goes on to illustrate how many DNA exonerations there were across the country, in particular in her own backyard of Boston. And Mr. Beasley continues stating that Kathy responded to his letter, and in turn he wrote her back again. And he says, quote, my response took the gloves off a bit more by pointing out that she was missing a very important point, that Mr. Grisham's book may just have well centered on the two cases from her hometown rather than the ones from ours. And his column went on to highlight, at this time there was 190 exonerations across 31 states. And he is quoted saying, should 190 district attorneys be ousted for doing what they were paid to do, i.e., convict those whom the police presented as suspects? No, neither should ours. And I quite wondered if Mr. Beasley ever took the time to read any of the civil suit. I mean, it was in his newspaper office where I initially found some of that testimony. I was always curious that I wondered if he had ever taken the time to read that as well. Because it was very evident that Grisham's book was certainly shedding light on this division of those that had the unwavering support of the district attorney and the police officers, like Mr. Beasley, and those who might have seen a different side to things. But it seemed like everyone had a very strong opinion about the Innocent Man book. But what was interesting is that it kept running into people who seemed to have the strongest negative opinion and were very angry about the town had been portrayed were the ones who hadn't read the book. Then there were those who were astonished that the criminal justice system functioned the way that it did, and how there was very little understanding of the victim experience. I mean, victims aren't asked, we're told. Just like we were told to leave the courtroom and how we weren't to go back in. We're told what's best for you. It's best for you not to see that. It's best for you to go here or there or not talk to this person. Or so others project their misguided assumptions on the victims and their families based on how they think they would handle the same situation. Because in these situations, your dependence on the police is immediate for victims and survivors of violent crime. They are the lifeline to your case. But really, in the eyes of the law, it's not your case. It's the state's case. It's the state versus whomever, not the victim versus whomever. The police and the prosecution are a team. And they handle all the information that the victim's family is craving. So any theory on what could or might have happened becomes your truth. And you surrender any doubts or concerns out of missing just the smallest of things that might mean something. So if your family falls prey to the police or the prosecution that is more concerned with getting a conviction than seeking the truth, everyone loses. For us, until Williamson and Fritz were exonerated, we had no sense of powerlessness because we were oblivious to the power structure. So during all this time, and back and forth, and people writing in, and the district attorney, Peterson, also took to writing, and he took to the internet to defend himself. And it really took me several days before I felt like I wanted to read what was posted on this website. And funny enough, someone in the DA's office who was casually talking to my mom said something about how the entire office was made to read Grisham's book and make notes and report back all the untruths that they found in the book. So, if Peterson's account followed along the same lines as his comments in the newspaper, I knew I needed to be emotionally prepared to read this. So finally I did, and I read through the 19 pages of his efforts to pick apart the book, and I was pissed. He would refer to his, quote, beloved hometown and the, quote, wonderful people of Ada, Oklahoma, as if we were all in this together. And it kind of felt like pandering. I mean, Grisham didn't tie the misdeeds of the police and the prosecution to the citizens of Ada. It was the prosecution who seemed to find a way to intertwine the two. I mean, if someone fails to do their job, how is that a reflection on the town where they live? It reminded me, I try to keep in mind that district attorneys are elected officials. And that makes them politicians. So after I had some time to process what he wrote, I really felt disheartened by the whole thing. I mean, I couldn't really blame him for wanting to defend himself, but it was the manner in which he did it. I mean, who was he writing this for? His defense read as if there were no findings since the original investigation and trials. And so I wondered if he really lacked the insight to understanding how they had screwed Debbie's case up, or on the other hand, were they just completely unaware of the atrocities that they had committed? Or maybe it was a combination of both. Peterson's last sentence of the second paragraph, I guess, landed the hardest for my heart. He wrote, when objectivity and balance are unduly compromised in favor of dramatic license, the truth suffers accordingly. And that was the truest thing that he wrote. I would find myself really overwhelmed by the constant opinions regarding Debbie's case, but sometimes I just couldn't stop reading them. And every few days there was somebody else who had something to say, but really knew nothing about what had happened. And I became more and more angry with wanting people to know what I knew about Debbie's case. And I wanted people to understand the bigger systematic problems. And I wanted people to see how removed victims and their families are from the justice process. And I just knew from the bottom of my soul that that could be accomplished by passing a law that would establish this Justice Commission that I had worked on the previous year. So I went back to my senator and asked her to file the bill again. So remember, this is the bill that we had tried to get passed the year before for a Justice Commission that never made it through the House of Representatives for a vote. But this particular year, the Oklahoma Senate was split 50-50, resulting in all the committees having co-chairs of both parties. And really, I felt like this was really good news, because Debbie's bill, what I call Debbie's bill, had been assigned to the Judiciary Committee. And the co-chair of that committee was the one Republican who had voted for the bill the year before. So actually I was ecstatic, because I felt like, the language was all the same. Nothing had changed, and he had voted for it the year before. And so I really felt like, this is going to be great. We're going to, make some headway. But every day I watched to see if the bill was going to get a hearing. And it never came up on the agenda. And it was just every single day, same thing, not coming up. And I had a baby just, I don't know, maybe a month before. And I decided I've got to go to the Capitol and figure out what is going on with this bill. So I leave my baby for the first time and head up to the Capitol. And I remember it was freezing cold, and it was almost still dark when I got there, because I wanted to get there right as things were starting to move around. And I went to the Republican co-chair. I went to his office first because I thought, it's a Democratic bill. My senator, filed it. It's got to be the reason it's not getting a hearing. Maybe he doesn't, remember or whatever. So I went straight to his office. And I explained who I was and how the language hadn't changed at all, and if he remembered that he'd voted for it last year, and how appreciative I was because, after I'd gone and thanked him for it. And I remember that the senator laid his head back in his chair and kind of leaned back just a little, and he crossed his arms and said, "Yeah, I remember you, and I don't have any problems with your bill being heard in my committee. Though you need to ask your Democratic co-chair why you're not getting a hearing." And I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And I thanked the senator for his time. And I marched my little high heels down the hall to the Democratic co-chair's office. And I explained to the receptionist who I was and why I was there and why I needed to speak to the senator. And she told me that he was very busy. And I asked to wait, and she said if I wanted to, I guess. And an hour and a half passed, and the senator would still not meet with me. And it felt very deliberate. And the longer I sat, the harder it was to fight back tears. And I excused myself and retreated to the bathroom and tried to take some deep breath and, talking myself off of an emotional ledge. And I didn't know if it was by design or plan, but it just felt deliberate that he wouldn't meet with me, that he wouldn't come out and talk to me. And so I went back into his office, and I could feel that I was going to start to cry. And it was that cry where then you get mad because you're about to cry. And I just left. And as I got on the elevator, I couldn't keep the tears at bay. And by now they're just streaming down my face. And I walked back to my car. And it was so cold, and I remembered that the snowflakes were like starting to swirl in the parking lot. And I got in my car, and I was just heartbroken. And I thought, You know, it snowed the day that they buried Debbie, and on the day that they buried Ron, and on the day that they buried the law that might have made a difference in someone else's family not to go through the harm of wrongful conviction. In the very wise words of my friend Stephen, came home to roost. That when it comes to politics, prepare to be disgusted. He was right, and I certainly was. So in the next episode, we'll talk about more that was unveiled through the civil suit. So feel free to send your questions, and I will do my best to answer them in a follow-up episode. You can go to defendingtheline.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Line on Instagram. You can watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Line, and I thank you for listening.